Welcome to U.S. History 1. Our first lesson is going to be about the Native Americans before European exploration. And this will lead us up to the year 1492 because that's when Columbus made the first lasting contact between Afro-Eurasia and the Americas. So we're going to talk about what the modern-day United States was like leading up to that point. And that means Native American history. So Native Americans make up about 1.5 to 1.7% of the modern-day U.S. population, according to the last census. But remember that there was a time when they were 100% of the U.S. population, namely in 1491, leading up to Columbus's discovery of what he called the New World. So I wanted to start with this quote from Colin Calloway. He is the professor of Native American history at Dartmouth, much more informed and educated about this than I am, and he says this: "There is no general agreement about the appropriate collective term to apply to the indigenous peoples of North America. Although I occasionally use the terms Native, Native American, Indigenous, First Nations, or First Americans, I most often use the term Indians or Indian people, which was the term most commonly used at the time." So the reason why he uses the term Indian is because that is what the primary sources that we're going to read use to talk about these people. And so any of those terms are fine. You'll hear me use the term Indian a lot simply because that is what European settlers called them at the time, who we call Native Americans today. So first I wanted to show you this population density map of North America before 1492. And as you see there, the most densely populated parts of North America were in southern Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. So southern Mexico in particular, that was the Aztec Empire. The largest city in North America before Columbus was Tenochtitlan. And as you see, the modern-day United States is less populated with Native Americans than Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. But if you look within the borders of the United States, you see that the most densely populated part is the West Coast here. Okay? So the West Coast of the United States, modern-day California, Oregon, Washington, and then getting up into Canada with British Columbia. So that whole area right there, that is the most densely populated portion of our country at this time. And the reason for that is because Native Americans came across the land bridge, we believe, that's the best guess we have at this point, across Siberia into Alaska, into modern-day Canada, and then settled in modern-day North America. Okay, so they came in this direction, and therefore this coast was much closer than the East Coast. All right, and that's the big reason why this region over here is more densely populated than this region. But we talk a lot more about these Native American tribes, people like the Iroquois and the Cherokee. And the reason why is because these were the tribes that Europeans came into contact with when they came across the Atlantic here. For example, in 1607, Jamestown, okay, right here, the English came into contact with the Powhatan Indians. 1620, when the Pilgrims came to Plymouth, right here, they came into contact with the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. All right, so that is the big reason why Eastern tribes seem to have a larger role in the history of America than the Western tribes, even though there were more people out west. All right, now we're going to look at a more detailed map, this one of the Native American tribes throughout the modern-day U.S. in 1491. And historians divide the cultural regions into about 8 regions here. So you see the 8 regions are the Northeast, right here, sometimes called the Eastern Woodlands, the Southeast, which is where Mississippi is, the Plains, the Southwest, the Great Basin, Plateau, And then you have the Northwest Coast and California. So some are much larger than others, but remember out west here, these are more densely populated. So each region had roughly similar population sizes. And I just wanted to zoom into each of these briefly and talk a little bit about each of the regions and maybe some names that might be familiar to you. A lot of U.S. cities that we know and have visited and have heard of, a lot of U.S. states are named after Indian tribes. So I did want to just very briefly go over each of these regions. So let's start with the Northeast here, some that might sound familiar to you. First off, we have the Ojibwe, and the Ojibwe right here, they were one of the largest tribes, one of the most densely populated tribes, as you could probably see on the previous map. A lot of Ojibwe Indians all around Lake Superior, even going into Canada. The Illinois tribe, which you see right here, that is where we get the name of the state of Illinois. One city I want to mention here is Cahokia. Cahokia right here was in the early 1400s, actually. It was the largest city in the modern day U.S., modern day North America, meaning north of Mexico. And it was a very large mound. It was this huge mound. You can still visit it today outside of St. Louis. And it was really kind of a trading hub of the ancient Mississippian civilizations that died off around 1450. All right, some other familiar names are going to be the Erie tribe, which is around Lake Erie, the Potawatomi you probably heard of, the Shawnee in modern-day Kentucky and Appalachia. That was one of the largest tribes as well. Here you see the Iroquois up here. Okay, so the Iroquois is actually a collective term to refer to 6 different tribes, which you see all right here. Now, up in this region of New England, these are the tribes that many of the original English settlers came into contact with. Okay, so for example, you have the Massachusetts tribe right here, and then right here you have the Wampanoag. Okay, remember the Wampanoag, those were the Indians who came into contact with the Pilgrims first, and then their rival tribe, the Narragansett, over here. Some other familiar names, the Mohican Indians, the Delaware Indians, Susquehanna, and then down here, where Jamestown was, you have the Powhatan Indians, the ones who came into contact with John Smith and the settlers at Jamestown. Okay, going further south here, we have the Southeast region, and getting into the early 1800s, there were 5 tribes in the Southeast that were collectively known as the 5 civilized tribes. That was a U.S. government term to refer to 5 Indian nations that had attempted to assimilate to U.S. culture, and that would be the Chickasaw, which you see right here in northern Mississippi and part of Tennessee, the Choctaw, which is in southern Mississippi. We all know about the Choctaw. In fact, it's the mascot of Mississippi College, and MC has a good reputation with the Choctaw Nation. And then the Cherokee, okay, is another one of the 5 civilized tribes. Now, the 2 others are not on this map because they had not developed yet by 1492, but they became who were called the Seminoles and the Creeks, and those were collectively known as the 5 civilized tribes who were eventually forced off their land on the Trail of Tears into this territory here that would later be known as Oklahoma. Okay, getting way ahead of ourselves there, but just know that that is coming. Some other familiar names you might see here: Tunica, so the city of Tunica was named after an Indian tribe. Natchez, Pascagoula, these are all really familiar names to anyone who has spent time in this region. All right, then we get to the Great Plains region. Travels all the way from Texas up to modern-day North Dakota. Some familiar names you might see here: the Missouri Indians, the Iowa Indians, the Kansas Indians. Later, the tribe called the Sioux, or the Lakota Sioux, became very dominant in this region, but they had not yet developed. Here you have the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Pawnee, some of the more well-known tribes in the modern-day Great Plains. The Great Basin is this region with the Rocky Mountains. So you have Colorado, Utah, parts of Nevada are all in this Great Basin area. And then the Southwest, that's going to be East Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. There are still a lot of Native Americans who live in these regions today. One of the largest tribes of the time and still today is the Navajo, which lived right here in modern-day New Mexico. All right, and the final three cultural regions are going to be California, Northwest Coast, and Plateau. Like I said, these are smaller geographically, but historians group them by themselves in cultural regions because there were just so many people there, so many tribes, compared to some of the more sparsely populated regions like the Great Plains. Now, this map is also divided up into linguistic groups. I'm not a linguist, but if you're into languages, there were over 2,000 distinct spoken languages in the Americas before Columbus arrived. And within languages, you have language families, okay? So as you see, this entire region that's in the red, all of these different tribes, including the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, they were all of the Gulf linguistic stock, okay? So for what it's worth there, this is also divided up into language families. And then the last map I want to show you is this one here, which shows the early Native American groups getting to the 1600s, okay? So what we just saw was the map of the U.S. in 1492. Here is what the U.S. came to look like in the 1600s. So by the 1600s, Europeans have been here over a century, and still the United States has not been established. Okay, so the United States was established in 1776. So in the 1600s, these regions are still owned, operated by the British over here. Okay, the British over here. This is when the 13 colonies were eventually established later in the 1700s, really, but you have some English settlements around here. For example, Jamestown here with the Powhatan, and then you have the Pilgrims up here in Massachusetts. And then you have the French. The French really explored the Mississippi River quite a bit, okay, and this kind of whole zone into modern-day Quebec, that was area that the French operated in. They would trap beaver pelts and they would trade with Native Americans. The French on the whole had a better relationship with Native Americans than the British or the Spanish because they didn't so much want to take the land and settle there to farm. They kind of wanted to share the land and use it for its resources. And then this whole region was being dominated by the Spanish. Okay, so the Spanish throughout the 1500s had a big hold on the New World. Really, everything south of here, going all the way down to the southern tip of South America, with the exception of Brazil, was colonized by the Spanish. So that whole region, this is kind of what the Europeans like to think of the map as, like that. This was New France, this was New England, this was New Spain. But really, that's kind of a European fantasy because, as you see, there were dozens of other nations in these regions here. And as you see, the same 8 regions that we saw on the previous map, only now you see some new tribes. Okay? You see the Creek, for example. You see the Sioux up here. And also, some of these tribes have changed locations. So it's not that it's not like one tribe stayed on the same land for 1,000 years. You know, there was a lot of moving of borders. There was conflict between tribes, and because of that, there was a lot of change within the Indian tribal boundaries. Okay, and so when the English and the French and the Spanish came into North America, they were coming into a land that was already settled by all of these different Indian tribes, and then were met with the challenge of how to interact with them, how to either share the land or take the land. That gets into the conflicts that we will cover next class, all right? So that kind of brings us up to 1492, and next time we are going to talk about Columbus, the age of exploration, discovery, and settlement in what is now the United States.